Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The strategic landscape of 1944 was defined by an unprecedented level of clandestine sophistication, a shadow war fought with the weapons of imagination, misinformation, and calculated psychological manipulation. At the heart of the Allied triumph on the beaches of Normandy lay a masterpiece of subterfuge known collectively as Operation Bodyguard, within which Operation Fortitude South served as the primary instrument for anchoring the German Wehrmacht to the wrong coastline. The core objective was not merely to hide the fact that an invasion was coming, for that was impossible, but to convince the German High Command, and specifically Adolf Hitler, that the main thrust would occur at the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. This deception was a multi-layered construct involving the creation of entire phantom armies, the strategic use of double agents, the manipulation of radio traffic, and the exploitation of Hitler's own military prejudices. The genesis of this grand illusion can be traced back to the London Controlling Section, a small, highly secretive unit led by Colonel John Bevan. Bevan and his team understood that the success of Operation Overlord depended on preventing the German 15th Army, stationed in the Pas de Calais, from reinforcing the 7th Army in Normandy during the critical first weeks of the invasion. To achieve this, the Allies constructed a fictional narrative centered on the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. This was a paper army, existing only in reports, radio signals, and carefully placed visual decoys. To give FUSAG the necessary gravitas, the Allies assigned General George S. Patton to command it. The Germans held Patton in high esteem, viewing him as the Allies' most aggressive and capable field commander. By placing him in southeast England, directly opposite the Pas de Calais, the Allies played into the German expectation that their most formidable opponent would lead the primary assault at the shortest crossing point of the English Channel. The physical manifestation of this ghost army was a marvel of theatrical engineering. Along the coasts of Kent and East Anglia, the Allies deployed thousands of inflatable rubber tanks, wooden aircraft, and dummy landing craft. From a high-altitude reconnaissance flight, these decoys were indistinguishable from the real hardware. To further the illusion, British engineers used spoofing techniques, such as dragging heavy equipment to create realistic track marks in the mud and setting up fake mess halls and fuel depots. However, the visual deception was only the surface level of the ruse. The more profound deception took place in the electromagnetic spectrum. A small group of radio operators worked tirelessly to simulate the communications traffic of an army group numbering hundreds of thousands of men. They broadcasted mundane orders, sports scores, and personal messages, all designed to be intercepted by German signals intelligence. By analyzing the volume and origin of these signals, German intelligence officers concluded that FUSAG was a massive, ready-to-move force concentrated in the east, far from the actual assembly points of the invasion fleet in the West Country. Central to the success of Operation Fortitude was the double-cross system, managed by the 20 Committee under J.C. Masterman. By 1944, the British intelligence services had identified and turned nearly every German spy operating in the United Kingdom. Instead of executing or imprisoning these agents, the British used them to feed the Abwehr, German military intelligence, a carefully curated diet of truth and lies. The most significant of these double agents was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. A Spaniard with a profound distaste for fascism, Pujol had originally approached the British to offer his services but was rejected. Undeterred, he created a fictional identity as a pro-Nazi Spanish official and convinced the Germans he was spying for them in London. He built a complex network of 27 imaginary sub-agents, each with their own personality and access to different parts of the British military establishment. The information Garbo provided was so detailed and apparently accurate that he earned the Iron Cross from the Germans, while simultaneously receiving the MBE from the British. Garbo's masterpiece was his reporting in the days and hours surrounding June 6, 1944. He managed to convince the Germans that the Normandy landings were merely a large-scale diversion intended to draw German reserves away from the real target at Pas de Calais. Even after the Allied troops were on the ground in Normandy, Garbo continued to report that FUSAG remained in England, poised for the main strike. This information was critical in freezing the German 15th Army in place. Hitler, already predisposed to believe that the Pas de Calais was the logical target due to its proximity to the Ruhr industrial heartland and its shorter supply lines, clung to Garbo's reports. The psychological impact of this deception cannot be overstated. It created a paralysis of command within the OKW, the German High Command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were caught in a tug-of-war between their instincts and the intelligence they were receiving. The Germans' own technological hubris played a role as well. They relied heavily on their Enigma encryption machines, believing them to be unbreakable. However, the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had long since cracked the Enigma codes, a project known as Ultra. This gave Allied commanders a godlike view of the German reaction to their deceptions. They could read the German reports, see which lies were being believed, and adjust their narrative in real time. When the Allies saw that the Germans were shifting divisions toward the Pas-de-Calais in response to FUSAG's fictional movements, they knew the deception was working. This feedback loop allowed for a level of precision in psychological warfare that had never before been seen in the history of conflict. Another key figure in this web of lies was Duško Popov, codenamed Tricycle. A Yugoslavian double agent, Popov provided the Germans with information that reinforced the idea of an invasion in the Pas-de-Calais while also gathering intelligence on German preparations. His lifestyle as a high-rolling socialite provided the perfect cover for his movements. The Germans trusted him because he frequently provided them with high-grade, albeit non-vital, information that the British allowed him to pass. This layering of credibility was essential. If every piece of information were false, the Germans would eventually become suspicious. By mixing in significant amounts of truth, such as the actual names of units or the locations of certain headquarters, the lies became indistinguishable from reality. The deception also extended to the diplomatic and social spheres. Allied officers were instructed to leak false information in social settings where neutral diplomats or suspected German sympathizers might overhear. In one famous instance, a high-ranking officer was disciplined for loudly discussing the upcoming Pas-de-Calais invasion at a dinner party, a move that was itself a calculated part of the theater. The Allies even used the lost mail technique, where documents detailing fake plans were placed in the hands of couriers, who were then involved in staged accidents or captures. As D-Day approached, the Allied air forces began a systematic campaign of bombing known as the Transportation Plan. While the primary goal was to destroy French rail infrastructure, the weight of the bombing was heavily skewed toward the Pas-de-Calais. For every ton of bombs dropped on targets near Normandy, 2 tons were dropped in the north. This reinforced the German belief that the Allies were softening up the Pas-de-Calais for a primary assault. On the night of the invasion itself, the Allies employed window strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft to create the appearance of a massive naval fleet on German radar screens heading toward the Pas-de-Calais. This tactical deception, known as Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer, kept German coastal batteries and searchlights focused on the wrong horizon while the real armada slipped toward Normandy under the cover of darkness. The success of these efforts was manifested in the catastrophic delay of the German response. On the morning of June 6, when the first reports of landings in Normandy reached Hitler's headquarters at the Berchtesgaden, the Führer was asleep. His aides, fearful of his temper and convinced by months of deception that this was a mere feint, refused to wake him. By the time Hitler authorized the release of the panzer divisions held in reserve, the Allies had established a firm foothold. Even then, the 15th Army remained stationed at the Pas-de-Calais for 7 weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion that would never come. This strategic hesitation allowed the Allies to build up their forces, break out of the hedgerow country, and begin the liberation of Europe. The art of deception in 1944 was not just about tricks and mirrors, it was a comprehensive integration of all branches of intelligence and military operations. It required an intimate understanding of the enemy's psychology, a disciplined control over information, and the courage to bet the lives of thousands on the believability of a lie. The Pas-de-Calais remained a fortress guarding nothing, while the actual gate to the continent was forced open at Normandy. This triumph of the mind over the machine stands as one of the most significant achievements in the history of military intelligence, demonstrating that in war, the most powerful weapon is often the one the enemy never sees coming because they have been told exactly where to look for it. The historical significance of Operation Fortitude also lies in its legacy of modern information warfare. It proved that reality could be constructed for an adversary if one controlled the channels through which that adversary perceived the world. The German intelligence apparatus, despite its reputation for efficiency, was systematically dismantled and rebuilt as a tool for Allied strategy. The double-cross system transformed the Abwehr into an unwitting auxiliary of the British Secret Intelligence Service. The analytical failure of the Germans was not a lack of data, but an inability to synthesize that data against a backdrop of manufactured noise. They saw what they expected to see, a cognitive bias that the London controlling section exploited with ruthless efficiency. In the final analysis, the deception that made Hitler guard the wrong coast was a synergy of human intelligence, technological mastery, and psychological insight. It turned the English Channel into a theater of the absurd where rubber tanks held back real panzers and imaginary generals outmaneuvered the veterans of the Eastern Front. The silence of the 15th Army's guns at the Pas de Calais on June 6 was the loudest testament to the success of this grand illusion. The Ghost Army had won a battle without firing a shot, proving that the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to convince them to defeat themselves through their own certainty. This operation remains the gold standard for strategic military deception, a reminder that the narrative of a war is often written in the shadows long before the first bullet is fired in the light of day. The depth of the deception also relied on the strategic use of neutral countries. Allied intelligence frequently utilized Lisbon, Stockholm, and Madrid as conduits for disinformation. These cities were hubs for international espionage, where agents from both sides mingled in a tense, unofficial neutrality. By leaking confidential documents or allowing careless talk among diplomats in these locations, the Allies ensured that the German intelligence stations there would report these findings back to Berlin. Because these reports came from multiple, seemingly independent sources, the Abwehr gave them higher credibility scores. This multi-channel verification was a hallmark of the Allied strategy, ensuring that when Hitler looked at his intelligence maps, the arrows pointing to the Pas de Calais were confirmed by signals from London, reports from Madrid, and observations from the skies over Kent. Furthermore, the role of Operation Zeppelin in the Mediterranean and other subsidiary deceptions should not be overlooked. These operations were designed to keep German forces tied down in the Balkans, Italy, and Norway, preventing them from being transferred to France. By creating threats on the periphery of the Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, the Allies forced the German High Command to spread their resources thin. The threat to Norway, in particular, was so effectively simulated that Hitler insisted on keeping nearly 300,000 troops there, far away from the decisive theater in France. This holistic approach to deception meant that the lie of the Pas de Calais was supported by a global framework of secondary lies, all reinforcing the central theme that the Normandy landings were an outlier, a distraction from the main event. The human element of the deception also extended to the highest levels of the Allied command. Even the timing and location of General Eisenhower's public appearances were carefully choreographed. The movements of King George VI and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were used to signal interest in certain geographical areas over others. Every public gesture was a calculated note in a grand symphony of misinformation. The sheer scale of the coordination required between the military, the intelligence services, and the political leadership was unprecedented. It required a level of secrecy that, in a modern era of satellite surveillance and instant communication, seems almost miraculous. The success of the deception ultimately rested on the fact that the Allies knew the Germans better than the Germans knew themselves. They knew Hitler's obsession with the shortest route, his distrust of his generals, and his reliance on intuition. By feeding that intuition exactly what it wanted to see, they turned the dictator's greatest strength, his absolute control, into his greatest weakness. As the summer of 1944 progressed and the Allied bridgehead in Normandy became an unstoppable force, the deception shifted but did not end. The Allies continued to simulate the existence of FUSAG to prevent the Germans from moving their 15th Army even as the front line in Normandy was collapsing. It was only when the Allied armies actually reached the Pas de Calais from the landward side that the myth of the Ghost Army was finally extinguished. By then, the German army in France was in full retreat, and the strategic victory of D-Day had been secured. The art of deception had not only protected the invasion fleet but had effectively shortened the war by months, saving countless lives on both sides. The mastery of the Great Lie remains a chilling and brilliant chapter in the annals of history, a testament to the power of the human mind to reshape reality in the service of a greater cause. The organizational structure behind this was the Committee of Seven, which coordinated the activities of the LCS and the XX Committee. Their work was characterized by a meticulous attention to detail that bordered on the obsessive. For example, when creating a fake sub-agent for Garbo, they would invent a full biography, including family history, political leanings, and even personal habits. This ensured that if the Germans ever tried to cross-reference the agent's background, the story would hold up. One such fake agent was a disaffected Welsh nationalist, who supposedly lived near a sensitive military installation. The British even went so far as to plant fake newspaper articles in local Welsh papers to confirm the existence of radical groups that this agent was allegedly a part of. This level of world-building is more commonly associated with fiction than military planning, but in the context of 1944, it was a vital necessity. The psychological toll on the double agents themselves was immense. Men like Juan Pujol Garcia and Dusko Popov lived in a constant state of high-stakes theater, knowing that a single slip-up or a moment of inconsistency could lead to their exposure and certain death. They had to maintain their German personas while working under the intense scrutiny of the British handlers. The relationship between the agents and their handlers was one of mutual dependence and extreme tension. The handlers had to ensure the agents stayed motivated and sane, while the agents had to deliver performances that could fool the most suspicious minds in the Abwehr. The fact that the system never once broke down during the lead-up to D-Day is a testament to the extraordinary discipline and character of these individuals. The impact of the deception on the German side was a slow-motion collapse of strategic coherence. German intelligence officers, such as Colonel Alexis von Rohn, who was responsible for the Foreign Armies West section, actually began to suspect that the Allied strength was being inflated. However, Rohn, who was secretly anti-Nazi, may have deliberately passed on the inflated Allied troop counts to the High Command to encourage a defensive posture that he knew would fail, or perhaps to prevent a preemptive German attack that might have succeeded. The layers of deception thus reached even into the internal politics of the German resistance. The ambiguity of who knew what and when they knew it adds a further dimension of complexity to the history of Operation Fortitude. In the end, the art of deception was successful because it was not a single lie, but an entire environment of falsehood. It was an atmosphere that the Germans inhaled with every report, every radio intercept, and every aerial photograph. It was the construction of a parallel reality that was more logical and more convincing than the truth. When the Allied soldiers waded through the surf on the morning of June 6, they were protected not only by the steel of their ships and the fire of their guns but by a shield of shadows and a fortress of fictions that had been built over years of patient, dangerous work. The wrong coast was guarded because the right coast was hidden in plain sight, obscured by the very brilliance of the deception that surrounded it. The logistical complexity of maintaining the illusion of FUSAG also involved the Quicksilver series of plans. Quicksilver I focused on the basic story of FUSAG's existence, while Quicksilver II dealt with the radio deception. Quicksilver III was the visual deception, and Quicksilver IV dealt with the air plan, ensuring that the bombing patterns suggested a Pas-de-Calais focus. Quicksilver V was the deception concerning the timing of the main invasion, and Quicksilver V focused on the naval movements. Each of these sub-plans was managed by a different group of specialists, all reporting back to the London controlling section. This compartmentalization was crucial for security, but the synchronization was what made the deception effective. It was a total war effort in the realm of the mind. The naval aspect of the deception involved Operation Neptune, the actual naval component of Overlord, being shielded by Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable. These operations involved small boats towing large balloons equipped with radar reflectors. These boats moved at the speed of a large convoy toward the French coast near Boulogne and Dieppe. As they moved, they broadcast the sounds of a massive fleet, anchor chains clanking, men shouting, and engines revving, using high-powered loudspeakers. This acoustic and electronic ghost fleet drew the attention of German radar operators and coastal lookouts away from the real armada moving toward Normandy. The precision required for these boats to maintain their formation and speed to mimic a 15-knot convoy was extreme, and it was executed perfectly under the most hazardous conditions. The air deception was equally sophisticated. On the night of the invasion, the RAF and the USAAF engaged in Operation Titanic. This involved dropping dummy paratroopers, known as Ruperts, in areas far from the actual drop zones. These dummies were equipped with explosive charges that mimicked the sound of gunfire and grenades upon landing. A small group of SAS soldiers accompanied these dummies to play recordings of battle sounds and fire real weapons, creating the impression of a massive airborne landing in the interior of France. This caused the Germans to scramble their reserves to chase ghosts in the woods while the real 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were securing the flanks of the Normandy beaches. The long-term effects of this deception changed the nature of military intelligence forever. It shifted the focus from merely gathering information to the active management of the enemy's perceptions. The lessons learned in 1944 were integrated into the Cold War strategies of both the West and the Soviet Union. The concept of maskirovka, or military deception, became a core doctrine of the Red Army, while the Western powers refined their psychological operations and electronic warfare capabilities. The Pas de Calais ruse remains the ultimate example of how a weaker force, in terms of being the attacker against a fortified defender, can use intelligence as a force multiplier to achieve a decisive victory. In concluding this analysis, it is essential to recognize that the deception was successful not because the Germans were incompetent, but because the Allies were superlative in their execution. The Abwehr was a sophisticated intelligence service, but it was outmatched by a cross-disciplinary team that combined the talents of novelists, magicians, engineers, radio operators, and career spies. They understood that the most effective lie is one that the victim wants to believe. Hitler wanted to believe the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais because it fit his strategic worldview. The Allies simply gave him the evidence to justify his own error. The Guard remained on the wrong coast because the mind of the defender had already been conquered long before the first Allied soldiers set foot on the sand. The legacy of this deception is a testament to the complexity of truth in wartime and the enduring power of the human imagination to shape the course of history. The intricate details of Operation Bodyguard reveal a level of coordination that spanned continents. While Fortitude South focused on the Pas de Calais, Fortitude North was aimed at Norway. This involved the creation of the fictional British Fourth Army, headquartered in Edinburgh. To make this army seem real, the Allies used similar radio deception techniques and even arranged for leaks in the Swedish press about British troops practicing mountain warfare and cold weather operations. This forced the Germans to keep 13 divisions in Norway, divisions that could have turned the tide in Normandy if they had been available. The sheer breadth of the deception meant that the German high command was looking in every direction except the right one. The success of the Garbo network was particularly significant because it provided a consistent, high-level source of information that the Germans had come to rely on over a period of years. Juan Pujol's ability to weave a narrative that was both complex and internally consistent was a work of genius. He even sacrificed some of his imaginary sub-agents, reporting their arrest by British authorities to explain why certain pieces of information were delayed or missing. This added a layer of realism and grit to his reports that made them even more believable. When he finally sent the message on June 9, 1944, confirming that the Normandy landings were a diversion, it was the culmination of 3 years of painstaking character development and trust building. The Germans believed him because they felt they had vetted him through his years of service. The use of General Patton as a decoy was perhaps the most brilliant stroke of psychological warfare in the entire operation. The Allies knew that the Germans were obsessed with the cult of the personality in military leadership. By playing into this, they used Patton's reputation as a hard-charging, aggressive leader to validate the existence of FUSAG. Patton himself was frustrated by his role as a stage general, but he played the part with his characteristic flair, appearing at public events in the east of England and allowing his presence to be noted by neutral observers. To the German mind, it was inconceivable that the Allies would launch their greatest offensive without their best general at the spearhead. The absence of Patton in the initial Normandy waves was seen by the Germans not as a sign that they were wrong about the location, but as proof that the real invasion under Patton was yet to come. The technical execution of the radio deception, known as Operation Quicksilver II, involved a unit called the 5th Liaison Unit. These specialists used mobile transmitters to simulate the radio traffic of multiple divisions. They had to be incredibly careful to mimic the specific fist or typing style of different radio operators, as German signals intelligence could identify individual operators by their touch on the telegraph key. The operators moved their equipment around the English countryside to simulate the movement of units to their embarkation points. This electronic theater was so effective that German intelligence maps of the UK in May 1944 showed a massive concentration of forces in the southeast, exactly where the Allies wanted them to be. The logistical support for the deception was also immense. Thousands of men were involved in the construction and maintenance of the dummy equipment. The Special Canals unit of the Royal Engineers was responsible for creating the inflatable tanks and vehicles. These decoys had to be moved and serviced regularly to make them look like active equipment. If a tank sat in the same spot for weeks without moving, it would be a clear sign of a decoy. Therefore, teams would go out at night to shift the positions of the inflatables and create new track marks. The level of physical labor involved in maintaining this ghost army was a significant part of the overall invasion effort. The intelligence gathered by the British double-cross system was not just used for deception, but also for counter-espionage. By controlling the German spy network in the UK, the British could ensure that no real information about the Normandy preparations ever reached Berlin. Any genuine spy who managed to land in Britain was quickly captured and either turned or neutralized. This created a sanitized environment in which the only information the Germans received was the information the Allies wanted them to have. It was a total monopoly on the enemy's intelligence stream, a situation that is almost unique in the history of warfare. The final component of the deception was the deception of the self. The Allied planners had to be so disciplined that even within their own ranks, only a handful of people knew the full extent of the ruse. This need-to-know policy was strictly enforced to prevent accidental leaks. The fear was that if a single lower-level officer knew that FUSAG was a fake, they might inadvertently reveal it in conversation or through their actions. The secret of fortitude was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, known only to the Big Three: Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and a very small circle of top military and intelligence leaders. In the end, the art of deception succeeded because it was a perfect marriage of high-level strategy and low-level detail. It recognized that in the chaos of war, the human mind seeks patterns and certainty. By providing the Germans with a clear, logical, and well-supported pattern, the Allies led them down a path of their own making. The wrong coast was not just a geographical error, it was a failure of imagination on the part of the German High Command and a triumph of creativity on the part of the Allies. The legacy of Operation Fortitude serves as a powerful reminder that in the contest of nations, the ability to outthink the enemy is just as important as the ability to outfight them. The phantom armies of Kent and the silent agents of London were just as vital to the liberation of Europe as the soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy. The strategic patience required for Operation Fortitude was perhaps its most demanding aspect. The Allies had to maintain the illusion for months, even when the pressure to launch the invasion was reaching a breaking point. Every day that passed was another day for the Germans to potentially spot a flaw in the deception. The tension within the London controlling section must have been unbearable as June 1944 approached. They were essentially playing a high-stakes game of poker with the fate of the Western world on the line, and they were bluffing with an empty hand. The fact that they never blinked, even when the Germans made moves that threatened to expose the ruse, is a testament to their nerves of steel. The role of the British Political Warfare Executive, PWE, also contributed to the environment of deception. The PWE was responsible for black propaganda, information that purported to come from within the enemy's own ranks. They operated secret radio stations that broadcast to German soldiers, spreading rumors of discontent within the German High Command and suggesting that the real defense of the Reich should be focused on the Pas de Calais. These broadcasts often contained accurate details about German unit movements and names of officers, which gave them an air of authenticity. This psychological subversion from within the German military's own information space added another layer of confusion to an already complex situation. The impact of the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler also played into the hands of the Allied deceivers. In the aftermath of the failed coup, the German High Command was paralyzed by suspicion and purges. Hitler's distrust of his generals reached a pathological level. This made him even more likely to rely on the loyal reports from agents like Garbo and less likely to listen to the warnings of his field commanders in Normandy. The internal chaos of the Nazi regime provided the perfect fertile ground for the Allied seeds of deception to grow. The Great Lie thrived in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, where objective truth was a dangerous commodity. Furthermore, the Allied control of the air was essential for the visual deception. Because the RAF and USAAF had achieved air superiority over Western Europe, German reconnaissance flights over England were rare and extremely hazardous. When a German plane did manage to break through, the Allies often knew about it in advance through ultra-intercepts and would ensure that the pilot saw exactly what they wanted him to see. They might even allow a reconnaissance plane to return home if they were confident it had photographed a dummy tank farm or a fake landing craft concentration. This managed visibility was a critical part of the air war that is often overshadowed by the great dogfights and bombing raids. The naval deception also included the use of sonic warfare. The Royal Navy developed specialized equipment to play recordings of naval activity at high volume. These recordings were not just simple loops but were complex soundscapes that included the noises of specific types of ships. On the night of D-Day, these soundscapes were used to convince German coastal listeners that a massive fleet was maneuvering just offshore from the Pas-de-Calais. Combined with the window, radar interference and the visual decoys, this created a multi-sensory illusion that was almost impossible to penetrate in the heat of the moment. The tactical deception on the beaches themselves should also be noted. At some locations, the Allies used smokescreens and naval gunfire to obscure the size and nature of the landings. They also used frogmen to clear obstacles and place markers, but in some cases, these markers were intentionally placed to suggest a different landing pattern than the one actually being used. Every level of the operation, from the strategic to the tactical, was infused with the spirit of deception. It was a comprehensive philosophy of war that prioritized the subversion of the enemy's mind over the destruction of their body. The legacy of Operation Fortitude continues to be studied in military academies around the world. It is the quintessential case study in the importance of intelligence preparation of the battlefield. It shows that the most successful military operations are those where the enemy's response is anticipated and neutralized before the battle even begins. The art of deception was not a sideshow to the main event of D-Day. It was the framework that made the main event possible. Without the ghost armies of Fortitude, the actual armies of Overlord might have met a very different fate on the shores of France. The final irony of the Pas-de-Calais deception is that it was so successful that even after the war, some German officers refused to believe they had been fooled. They clung to the idea that there really had been a FUSAG and that the Allies had simply changed their plans at the last minute. This speaks to the profound power of a well-constructed lie to become a person's reality. The London controlling section had not just fooled the German high command for a few weeks, they had rewritten the history of the war in the minds of their enemies. The wrong coast remained the right coast in the German imagination long after the war was lost, a final victory for the architects of the Shadow War. The complexity of the operation also extended to the use of special means, which included the coordination of resistance groups in occupied Europe. The SOE, Special Operations Executive, and the French resistance were given instructions to increase their sabotage activities in the Pas-de-Calais area in the weeks leading up to D-Day. This surge in resistance activity was interpreted by the Germans as a sign that the local population was preparing to support an imminent invasion. By sacrificing some resistance cells in the north to draw German attention away from the south, the Allies demonstrated a cold-blooded commitment to the success of the overall deception. The human cost of these sideshows was significant, but it was seen as a necessary price for the success of Overlord. In retrospect, the success of the deception at the Pas-de-Calais was a result of the perfect alignment of Allied ingenuity and German vulnerability. It was a moment in history where the tools of modern warfare, radio, radar, mass production, and professionalized intelligence were harnessed to achieve a result that was as old as the Trojan horse. The art of deception was the ultimate force multiplier, allowing a complex and risky amphibious assault to succeed against a prepared and formidable defender. The guard on the wrong coast remains a symbol of the power of the lie to defeat the sword, and the brilliance of the few to save the lives of the many. This narrative of deception is not just a story of clever tricks, but a fundamental shift in the paradigm of conflict. It marked the transition from a war of attrition to a war of cognition. In the centuries before, battles were largely won by the side with more men, more guns, or better terrain. In 1944, the decisive factor was the side with the better story. The Allies' ability to tell a consistent, compelling, and ultimately false story to Adolf Hitler was what won the Battle of Normandy. The Pas de Calais was a masterpiece of fiction that changed the physical world, a reminder that the most important territory in any war is the 6 inches of space between the enemy's ears. The final phase of the deception, known as Fortitude South II, was perhaps the most audacious. It involved maintaining the fiction of FUSAG even as the Allies were fighting their way through the Normandy hedgerows. The goal was to prevent the German 15th Army from moving south to reinforce the 7th Army. To do this, Garbeau and other agents reported that the Normandy landings were a trap designed to draw the German reserves away so that the real invasion could take place at the Pas de Calais against a weakened defense. Remarkably, the German High Command believed this for 7 weeks. It was only in late July, when the American breakout during Operation Cobra made it clear that Normandy was the decisive front, that the 15th Army was finally ordered to move. By then, it was too late. The German army in the west was being destroyed in the Falaise pocket, and the liberation of Paris was only weeks away. The success of Fortitude South II is one of the most incredible chapters in the history of espionage. It required the Allies to maintain a straight face while their actual forces were engaged in one of the largest battles in human history. It required the double agents to continue their dangerous work under even greater scrutiny. And it required Hitler to ignore the reality of the situation in favor of the fantasy that had been constructed for him. The fact that he did so is a testament to the effectiveness of the initial conditioning he had received in the months before D-Day. Once he had committed to the idea of the Pas de Calais, he found it nearly impossible to admit he was wrong, even as his empire collapsed around him. The art of deception thus achieved its ultimate goal, the total paralysis of the enemy's strategic will. The 15th Army, one of the most powerful formations in the German military, sat idle during the most critical period of the war, waiting for an army that didn't exist to land at a beach that wasn't being targeted. This was the true triumph of the London controlling section and the double-cross system. They had not just moved some rubber tanks, they had moved the entire German high command into a state of cognitive dissonance from which they never recovered. The victory at Normandy was won in the fields of Kent and the offices of London as much as it was on the sands of Omaha and Juno. The wrong coast remains a monument to the power of the mind to outmaneuver the machine, and the enduring legacy of the greatest deception in the history of warfare. The depth of the historical record confirms that without the art of deception, the Normandy landings would have faced a far more concentrated and effective German counterattack. The ability of the Allies to keep the 15th Army in the Pas de Calais was the single most important factor in the survival of the bridgehead during the first 48 hours. The military genius of the operation was not in its complexity alone, but in its profound understanding of the human condition, specifically the tendency of the powerful to become prisoners of their own expectations. The Allies built a prison of expectations for Hitler, and he walked into it willingly, locking the door behind him. The guard on the wrong coast was not a mistake, it was a masterpiece.